Hello and welcome to our weekly podcast here at WIPEC. This week we focus on the situation of the Ukrainian refugees. And what better expert to talk about the topic than sociologist and migration researcher Gerald Knaus. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
You helped to negotiate the Europe-Turkey migrant deal in 2016, and in 1999 you co-founded the European Stability Initiative, which resides in Sarajevo, Bosnia. Mr. Knaus, you taught economics for 1 year in Czernowitz in Ukraine. Your grandmother lived in Mariupol, if I am informed rightly. What are your personal connections to Ukraine and maybe also to Russia?
Well, the most important connection is that in the last 30 years, I spent a lot of time in Ukraine. I also traveled to Russia a lot. In our family, there's always been a great interest in that region. My aunt was called Ludmila because my grandfather on my father's side, who was a prisoner of war in the First World War in Russia, apparently had fallen in love there and had a romantic relationship to Russia. So my father, when he studied at the university, studied Russian. All my children have been studying Russian, including spending time in Russia, in Karelia. And the last time in 2015, the whole family went to Kiev, and we actually, in a Georgian-run language school, everybody was studying Russian in Kiev. I lived in Ukraine for a year. I was teaching economics at the University of Czernowitz in German, close to the border with Romania. And since then, I've been back a lot. In 1993, I was in Crimea. I've been to Kiev a lot. I've also been to Russia and Moscow, including as a fellow at the Carnegie Institute in Moscow at the height of the last refugee crisis in autumn 2015. So following this region for a very long time, many meetings with friends there for many years. I used to meet at least once a year with Boris Nemtsov, who was later shot. And this interest, of course, means that this crisis feels very close.
Okay, maybe bring us up to speed about the migration crisis we have now. How many people are on the move at the moment? How many will we expect? Will we have to expect in Europe? And where are they at the moment?
Yes, well, what we are facing is already the biggest refugee crisis in Europe since the 1940s. We already have close to 4 million people estimated who entered the European Union. We have many more already, estimated 6 million internally displaced in Ukraine. And that's very uncertain as a number because, of course, we have many people trapped in cities where they really would have to leave because Russian brutal warfare is destroying the foundation for civilized life. We've seen a big city of a few 100,000 people, Mariupol, being really destroyed, as was Grozny and Aleppo in the past. So we can expect, and this is most important for policy, that there will be many more refugees. The war is likely to continue the way it looks now. And if the war continues and is fought the way it is fought now, and if the economic and social situation in Ukraine continues to deteriorate as Russia tries to destroy infrastructure, make agriculture impossible, and attack urban centers, we should be preparing for many million more refugees arriving in Europe. And at this moment, we are not prepared. And that is bad for those who come, because we will not be able to, unless we prepare now, we are not going to be able to fulfill our promises to have humane reception and allow people to have a roof over their head and children in school. That will be very difficult without quick preparation. And it's also bad for politics in Europe, because it's easy to foresee how more chaos than is strictly unavoidable could lead to the kind of political campaigns that lead to polarization inside societies, inside the European Union, tensions, and in the worst case, rising dissatisfaction with the refugees we promised to help. So we need to get our act together very quickly.
Well, the European Union reacted quite fast and surprisingly united on the mass influx. They provided all people with an Ukrainian residency permit temporary protection. What exactly does this mean? What can these people do within the European Union?
So if I say that we are not prepared, I don't mean this in any way as a criticism of existing institutions, either in Brussels or in the member states, because you can't be prepared for a catastrophe of historic proportions. And it is also true that the key decisions that were taken in Brussels by member states upon the proposal of the Commission to grant all Ukrainians who come to the European Union immediately the right to a residency anywhere in the EU, plus social support work and to education and healthcare support. This is historic too. Now, there wasn't much of a choice, to be honest, because Ukrainians had visa-free travel and nobody even dreamt of closing the border. So it was clear that any Ukrainian who wanted to flee could flee. They're not coming irregularly. They're not coming with smugglers. They just arrive at the border. So it was also clear that this could not be dealt with by asylum systems. You know, if you have 1 million arrive a week in the first 3 weeks, every asylum system in Europe would collapse. So it was the wise, historic, important, but in some way inevitable decision the interior ministers took. But now starts the difficulty. When the decision was taken, very few expected the kind of numbers of people arriving we see now. We don't know how the war continues, but if the war extends to Odessa, which we must fear, if the brutality around urban centers continues for another 2 months, like we've seen in the last months, then there will not, as they were in the last 4 weeks, be able to be accommodated by private individuals in Poland or Moldova or the Czech Republic or Slovakia or Hungary. For the simple reason that this massive popular mobilization, you know, it will reach its limits. Already in Poland, there are many people who've been accommodated privately or in hotels that it's not clear where they can stay in a few weeks when these hotels will want to go back to hosting tourists. And if more millions come, where will they go? Will they distribute themselves, as some were hoping a few weeks ago in Brussels, and still some hope in Western Europe that somehow this can work without organized relocation or distribution of refugees? And I don't think this is responsible to expect this. You know, you will have mothers with children arriving in the European Union, elderly people. They don't know anybody. Those who know somebody have already, in many ways, gone and visited their family and friends. And as people arrive, they will be vulnerable to exploitation. There is already a serious, justified fear of you know, sexual trafficking and abuse to try to take advantage of young women with children who don't know where to go. And so we need to organize this. And we need to organize this also to preserve the empathy, which is real. People in Europe want to help, and they want to help from Ireland to Moldova, from Portugal to Finland. There is a lot of empathy, but if it's not organized, if we don't manage in the next few weeks to move hundreds of thousands of people with an airlift to Spain, Portugal, France, Britain, well, then we will have very likely a very, very chaotic situation with a lot of avoidable human suffering and with political consequences that are very bad for our democracy.
You once issued the idea of an international refugee coordinator, and you also mentioned the name Barack Obama, if I'm right. What's happened to this idea?
Well, I said we would need for Europe a European Barack Obama. So basically charismatic. Okay. I mean, if he's available, all the better. I mean, honestly, if he or his wife, you know, if somebody who is a good spokesperson who can, let's first start with what we need. So let's say in the next week, numbers have slightly gone down, but they are still very high. 30,000 people a day arriving in Poland. Now, a few thousand are trying to go back. but that's still many times more than arrived at the height of 2015. And then we have people arriving in Slovakia and in Hungary and in Romania and in Moldova. So let's say every day, the next few weeks, we stay with 40, 50,000 arriving in the whole EU. That is more than 1 million a month. So these people arrive. You can't then just say, listen, get on a train ticket, trains are free, find yourself a home. That won't work. You could organize reception at hubs in the receiving countries. Say, here on standby are buses, trains, or more important, planes that would take you to a hub in Spain, in France, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Ireland. And we guarantee you, if you go to that hub, you'll have a bed, you'll have the healthcare for immediate attention, and you get advice there how to find a place, again, within another 2 or 3 days, where you could get a school for your child and a roof over your head. So this kind of communication needs to be well done, because why would a Ukrainian mother with 3 children whose husband is in Kiev or in Kharkiv or in Zaporozhye, why would that woman get on a plane to fly to a country she doesn't know? So you need to organize this. You need to communicate. You need to say that this is, you're not further away from your family. It's just a small, it's just a 1 hour flight or 1.5 hour flight. But it's better for you to do that. So you organize the reception. People get onto planes. The first planes that will leave probably half full. This is always the case with such programs. But then as people realize this is working, you would have a regular airlift of refugees arriving to hubs across Europe. These hubs need to be organized now. And from each hub, you can then organize in the country or in the region, Catalonia, Ireland, Central France, Portugal, distribution of people quickly into either private homes where people volunteer or state accommodation. But this needs to be organized now. And what we then ask for, this European Obama, basically a team of 4 or 5 politicians whose job it would be just to mobilize leaderships around Europe, talk to the mayors of the big cities, talk to the prime ministers, say, please create those hubs. Here is how it could work. Here is a model hub in Germany or in France. And then organize the communication towards the Ukrainian refugees, get the diaspora involved, have a phone number any Ukrainian in Europe can call that is widely advertised to give advice where you need to go. And finally, the third part, which is crucial, communicate about all these efforts in a way that reaches a lot of Europeans. Make sure people see what is happening. The positive stories, the inspirational stories, the stories of empathy, to sustain the goodwill and to already anticipate that the social media will very soon be flooded with negative stories by Putin's friends, right? And this team, appoint a former prime minister, a Carl Bildt, a Joschka Fischer, somebody who's young and energetic and has experience, has the phone numbers of leaders. Why not an American? Why not ask Barack Obama if he's willing to support this for a few months? Why not a Brit? And then make this a common effort of European and North American democracies to fulfill the promise of humane reception for Ukrainian refugees in the biggest movement of refugees worldwide very soon, since the 1970s, and perhaps very soon since the 1940s.
In the beginning, we had some kind of disturbing pictures at the Polish and Ukrainian borders that Ukrainians were allowed to pass, but others who had a permanent residency in Ukraine, like Indian students, weren't allowed to pass. Was this situation solved until now, or are there still such problems?
Look, it's clear that some of these instances have happened. They've been documented by serious journalists, but it's also clear that the European Union passed legislation that said anybody who is in Ukraine can enter the European Union. So if this happens, it's illegal. And I know that tens of thousands of foreigners who lived in Ukraine have been able to come to the European Union. And in fact, their governments are helping to evacuate them from Europe. I mean, listen, an Indian, and there were an estimated, I think, 20,000 Indian students in Ukraine, doesn't need protection in Europe. You know, it would be smart for Europeans to say, listen, you're an Indian engineering student in Ukraine. Here in Hungary, we offer you the chance to continue your studies. But it's not a human rights issue. You know, this would be nice. It might be in our interest. It would be certainly good for some of those students. But these are not people who don't have a home to which they can go to, which is different from both Ukrainians, Russians that are married to Ukrainians, for example, or asylum seekers that were in Ukraine. You know, they cannot go anywhere. And the legal situation is clear. All of them have the right to come to Europe. Any instance where this right is not respected needs to be highlighted. But let's be careful also that we don't fall into efforts to create negative stories for other purposes than helping people. I also learned that Russia Today, for example, and Russian news outlets were trying to spread these stories about racism at the border because they thought this might influence, you know, African countries' votes at the UN. So let's be careful how many instances there really are, and have not those that we know about from 2 weeks ago. What is going on now? Have a monitoring, report abuse. It's illegal. Anybody is supposed to enter, but my understanding is that most of them are entering. And so the thing that worries me more now is that we will have a lot of vulnerable people, including Ukrainians, arriving in the European Union and then being a target for traffickers. You know, I was one night when I worked as a volunteer at the Berlin main train station. You know, there's a lot of warning. People are warning volunteers, be careful, you know, what you see, because there are, and you see this middle-aged man with a teddy bear coming past midnight to the train station. And you know, you wonder, what are they trying to offer to the people who arrive there? And this is the main station in Berlin. There is a lot of security. People are told to, if they report anybody suspicious, you know, to call the police. But if around Europe, at all train stations in countries with perhaps less awareness or less capacity, because there are many more refugees concentrated now, organized crime or traffickers or just individuals try to prey on these women and children, you know, it's a disaster. We are betraying the promise of providing protection. And so this can only be avoided with better organization.
What are the main differences for you to the situation in 2015? I mean, obviously, the refugees that are coming have another cultural background, but what else are the main differences?
Well, there's a lot we can learn from this. I mean, the first thing we can learn from this is that politicians in democracies need public support to act. If we want politicians to act boldly, it is no use for NGOs like my friends and myself, or human rights NGOs, to tell them, please do 1, 2, 3, if the public is not on board. But if the public is on board, then politicians can take very bold decisions very quickly. And this is what happened here. Now, in 2015, there was a lot of empathy. I don't buy this story that in 2015, Europeans were racists and didn't welcome people from the Middle East. Germans, Swedes, Austrians welcomed huge numbers. And there was empathy, and it didn't die after a few weeks either. But it is true that at that time, around Europe, a lot of governments and a lot of publics did not see this crisis the way they see Ukraine. And now, partly it is to do with the basic fact that a lot of governments and societies can associate, can understand and empathize with the fate of these Ukrainians much more easily than they can with what happens in the Middle East. They know Ukrainians. You know, there are millions of Ukrainians who've visited Poland, who've worked in Poland. So Poles can identify very easily with the women and children that flee. They can identify with this sense of a Russian aggression. Czechs experienced it in 1968 when the Soviet Union and its allies destroyed the Prague Spring hopes. Hungarians in 1956. Around Europe, people see these images of a heroic smaller nation fighting against a big aggressor. this is much easier to explain than the complicated fighting that took place in Syria. And I'm not saying that experts have an excuse. You know, experts know that what happened in Syria was a very similar kind of war, even supported by Russia after autumn 2015 openly. But for the broader public, the story of what happens in Ukraine at this moment is very, very easy to grasp. There's an attack on civilians, women and children flee, men go the other way. You know, 180, 200,000 men from Europe, Ukrainians, went to Ukraine to fight. They have no other place to go to except Europe. You know, there isn't a country in between. And so the question is really, do we let them, you know, do we prevent them from leaving the cities where they are being bombed, or do we let them in? And I think for the moment, the answer of Europeans is, as I would have hoped, that there is no choice. We need to let people in. And I just wish that around the world, other regions of the world would react to such crises in the way I hope Europe will continue to react. There really is no excuse why in Asia, countries do not let refugees who have to flee in large numbers as well. You know, or if they let them in the distant past, you know, 20, 30 years ago to Pakistan and Iran, they are still in the precarious position decades later. Why do Afghans have to, if they need protection, and many do, have to hope to go to Europe or America? And why is there no program to let Afghans in need of protection come to Malaysia or Indonesia, you know, big middle-income countries in Asia? So I hope that what the Europeans are doing here will show also to others in the world that this kind of massive refugee movement, you know, is something that if you want to, you can deal with humanely.
In an interview you gave to the German TV station ZDF a few days ago, you also mentioned United Kingdom, that they are fast in providing weapons to the Ukraine, but very stepping back on accepting refugees. How is the situation there at the moment? Are they accepting more people now, or is this still difficult?
Well, I said that the key for politicians to make bold steps is public support. And so we saw that in Europe with this temporary protection directive of the European Union. We also saw it in countries like Switzerland or Denmark, which were not bound to have the same rules, but which adopted nationally very similar rules. So we have similar national protection rules that allow Ukrainians to come to Switzerland or to Denmark. The United Kingdom is the big exception. It's the only country in Europe now where Ukrainians need a visa, so they can't just go there. And they don't as a result, and we see the connection. If there wouldn't have been visa liberalization, we would have had a very different debate in Europe. But in the United Kingdom, you don't have visa liberalization, so there is no similar temporary protection scheme. So in the United Kingdom, the decision is how many do we let in? So we need an administration, we need to verify who we let in. And that is a problem, because what we see is a lot of public support. You know, when the government, under pressure from public opinion, said, okay, we create a program where a home for Ukrainians, where people can volunteer to take in a refugee, in a very short period of time, a huge number of people in the United Kingdom volunteered. The website crashed. But the program now needs to be organized so that it actually translates into big numbers. My proposal is that the Europeans help the UK. We create a set of hubs all around Europe. Let's say we create a big hub in Belgium or northern France. We have an airlift of refugees who arrive to take them to those hubs, you know, in Belgium or northern France. And then instead of having, you know, choosing and selecting people in Moldova or Romania or Poland, where there is already a large number of people arriving, the United Kingdom's officials can just go to those hubs and say, listen, we are prepared. We have an offer to accept 50,000, 60,000, 100,000 people by families in the UK. And we can do that very quickly from here. And then people can just get on a bus or the Eurostar or a flight, and we take them to the UK. This needs to be organized. If the Europeans create a set of hubs for an airlift within Europe, they should then appeal to the United Kingdom and Canada and other countries to take part in bringing in people from there as well.
Well, the United States, I think, already accepted 100,000 refugees. I don't know about Canada. So there are some.
Well, Canada gave an open-ended invitation in a sense.
Okay.
It remains, of course, to be administered because Canada, of course, also doesn't have an open door policy with no visas. But Canada is very, very interesting and important for the Europeans, not just symbolically, but if this turns out to be a longer displacement, if Germany accepts, it's not unrealistic that it will be many more than in 2015, that there will be 1.5 million, 2 million people in Germany. And if it then turns out, and nobody hopes that, especially not the refugees who want to go home to their families, but if it turns out that it will not be possible to return, then Canadian offers to bring a larger number of people, hundreds of thousands, 1 million, to Canada will then be very attractive also. Because of course there is a huge Canadian Ukrainian community, and Canada has a lot of experience in doing this. So the US promised 100,000 places, remains to be seen how this is administered. Again, it's important that it is fast. And again, if there could be a hub in Germany, where the US can help to bring people from there, all the better. But nothing will work without effective communication. And let's not forget, the women and children mainly who come to Europe at the moment do not want to emigrate. They want to have temporary protection to then go back to their families. It's only if Ukraine loses the war or loses territory that people will be forced to stay outside. So for the moment, the goal is to provide as humane a reception as possible for a large number of people who should have a normal life as soon as possible, be able to work, go to school, but who in the end want to go back to their country where their brothers, fathers, and husbands are now fighting to make that possible.
How is the European Border Control Organization FRONTEX doing in this whole set?
Well, it's very interesting. This offers a chance for FRONTEX to redeem itself, to do something really useful and also in line with EU values and EU legislation, because FRONTEX was rightly criticized a lot in recent years for looking the other way when national border guards were breaking the law at EU's borders. Now here, FRONTEX is really and could really be a useful, a key player if, for example, it helps countries like Moldova that like to have better control of their border, not to keep people out, but to know who comes in. And I know I had conversations with ministers in the Moldovan government a few times in the last 3 weeks. And one of the things they wanted, and now it's happening, is FRONTEX support to have better control of their border, precisely to let everyone who has the right to enter, which is, of course, as I said, all Ukrainians, all residents in Ukraine, all asylum seekers from Ukraine, they are all allowed to enter, but to know who is entering. Because the moment people are in the European Union in particular, in the Schengen area even more, it makes no sense. You can no longer control them. I mean, you can, of course, when the moment they register, you know where they register, but until that moment, they have the right to move freely around Europe without having to register. And this is unavoidable. That's how tourists or visitors, do it all the time. We don't know the Chinese visitors who enter the European Union by the millions each year before Corona as tourists. They go to France and then they can go to Germany and then they can go to Austria or Italy. We don't worry that we don't know at each moment where they are. The same for the Ukrainians. But the moment they need a service, they need support, they need a roof, they need social support, they will register. And in that moment, we know where they are. And FRONTEX can help with control at the external border that is fast, efficient, lets people in, and also gives a sense that we know who's coming in.
Is there a kind of Russian refugee movement already? Because we heard that many people try to get out of Russia because of the war, who don't want to live in this kind of society, of course, obviously. Do you know anything about that? Are they also
Yes.
openly accepted in Europe?
Well, it's very different because Russians never had visa-free travel. So Russians cannot just come to the European Union if they don't have a visa. Secondly, the connections are mainly cut. There are very few flights now. If you are a Russian, and I know many people that have lived in Russia, foreigners who've lived in Russia who tell me about what happens to their friends. Many Russians are trying to go to the countries where they can still fly to, Turkey, Armenia, Georgia, even Central Asia, because a lot of them rightly are very worried. Putin has threatened pro-Western, anti-war Russians. He's described them as traitors, people that, you should, like a fly that flies into your mouth, you should spit them out. I mean, this is terrifying language. And so there are Russians who have every reason to get protection, but it's not easy to get out. And obviously it makes sense for the European Union. And there normal asylum laws apply. If you to give the chance to Russians who need protection and who can't reach Europe, but who can reach Turkey, Armenia, or Georgia, in a way to allow some of them to come to Europe as refugees. But these numbers will be very small compared to what we are seeing currently with the legal arrivals of Ukrainians in, the hundreds of thousands. Okay, then some final question. You once suggested that Ukraine should be tied closer to Europe. On what basis? You mean economically, on the society basis, or what exactly do you mean by that? Should they come into the European Union? Should they be invited soon? Well, Ukrainians risked their lives in 2014, the so-called Euromaidan protests. Euromaidan, because the protests were linked to an association agreement to bring Ukraine's economy closer to Europe. Ukrainians have seen in the last 20 years what happened to countries that joined the European Union: Romania, Slovakia, Poland. And as Ukrainians can travel and as many Ukrainians work there, they could see the transformation. There's been a transformation in Ukraine as well. And we see that now. This state is, to some who don't know Ukraine well, they are amazed how robust it is. Banks are still working, trains are still working, cities are still supplying, when they are not completely destroyed like Mariupol, basic services. So Ukraine also has developed. But of course, being part of that zone of stability, the European Union, is attractive. And so when President Zelensky, in the middle of the beginning of the war, the first days of the war, said, we apply for membership, he deserves a response. And it is clear that at the moment, Ukraine is not able to lead the normal kind of standard negotiations the European Union has had with Montenegro for 10 years. But it's also clear that it would be disastrous to say, well, sorry, there's nothing we can do. So a lot of countries in Europe are actually asking for not just the signal, but a real process of linking Ukraine closer. And my colleagues and myself are proposing to offer to Ukraine, to offer to Moldova, and to offer to the 6 countries in the Western Balkans, all of them, instead of the current accession process that leads nowhere, immediate start of accession talks to a 2-step process where you first join the single market, which is what matters to citizens and the economy. It's what Norway has and Iceland. The 4 freedoms: freedom of movement for people, capital, services, and goods. And to offer that to all these countries as something that they can reach within a few years. So if that is the message, that countries could join the single market and be part of a borderless Europe within a few years, then that is something that I know from my conversations in Paris or Berlin. It's still a big step, but it might have a chance of being agreed upon, particularly if the Central Europeans, the Poles, the Czechs, the Baltics, but also others are demanding it from European leaders as a clear signal that the sacrifices Ukrainians are making in the name of Europe for the last 8 years actually will be responded to with a meaningful, not just gesture, but meaningful policy.
Okay, well, from listening to you, I think you may be a good candidate for the International Refugee Coordinator with all your experience, but we'll see how this situation will work out. Thank you.
Well, wait,
Okay.
I might be able to communicate about this because my colleagues and I have done this for a long time, but I do that anyways. But
Yeah.
what is needed is something that, you know, a former prime minister has.
Not well known enough, yeah.
No, it's not well known. It's that politicians, we are an NGO, but if you talk to politicians who've been running for office, who've been in those council meetings, who, politicians recognize each other, those who've been successful. And if you have a politician who calls, somebody who's been a prime minister who now calls the Spanish or Irish or British prime minister and says, listen, you've said you will welcome 10, 20,000 people. That's not enough. How do we make sure that in the next few weeks you can take in 100,000? I can have that. I have that conversation now with people, but it's different when it comes from somebody who's been a politician, who knows, how his colleagues work, and who has a mandate from the governments. Yes, NGOs can play a role. The last 24 hours, I talked to a lot of key players in Germany and in Europe, about these ideas. But to organize it, it needs to be somebody appointed by Macron and Scholz that all the governments recognize. And that's where, NGOs play a role, but we are not, we need a European Obama. We need that kind of credibility, and that's certainly not me.
Okay. Well, thank you for this interview. It gave many insights into the situation we have right now.
I thank you. And we need to also have civil society and the media, generate not just debates, but proposals, and not just the next 2 weeks, but the next 5 months, because this crisis challenges all of us.
Civil society is already doing much, so let's hope that also media will help in this part. Yeah. Well, thank you again for this interview, and all the best to you.
All the best to you. Thank you.